to the Wingwag. I'm your host, Jack O'Lynn. I'm an instrument-rated pilot and the owner of an aviation company and flight school here in Central Florida.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not guaranteed to be accurate or complete. While we research each topic, we are humans and occasionally make mistakes. For the most up-to-date information on regulations, check out the official Federal Aviation Regulations, also known as the FARs, or consult an aviation attorney. Thus, the Wingwag is not responsible for any direct. Lastly, the opinions expressed on this podcast are the guest's opinions and are not necessarily the opinions of the host or podcast. Welcome to this week's episode of the Wingwag. Ever since we did that episode a while back about GPS spoofing, I was really thinking about how does GPS even work, right? Like, how does a receiver in an airplane take in signals from a satellite many miles away in outer space and use that to compute your location? And then as I started researching this, it just got me thinking about all the other methods of navigation that we use in aviation, such as VORs and DMEs, which use a VHF radio signal to compute like the radial that you are on with respect to an airport and your distance to the airport. We have things like ILSs, which again, using a radio signal, like tell you if you're lined up with a runway, if you're too high, too low, to the left and to the right. Like, how do all of these work? There's technical answers to all of this, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But it just got me interested in kind of navigational systems in general, like early human history, navigating in boats up through the present. And as I was reading about and learning about all of these navigational systems, from things as simple as just dead reckoning up through things very complex like GPS, it gave me a real appreciation for human ingenuity, at least until recently. And maybe still recently, I would need to think about it. Navigation has played a critical role in the development of modern civilization. Navigation was at the forefront of exploring the earth and connecting the continents. It was big, and still is, for trade and commerce, for military operations and wars, as well as just travel. And because each of these factors is so important for civilization, navigation has, by necessity, had to be kind of on the bleeding edge of technology. And I remember after we recorded that GPS spoofing episode, I was a little bit depressed because we have such a nice navigational system in GPS. It's easy to use, it's relatively cheap, it's very, very accurate, and it works around the entire world. And just to see it slowly begin to not work in certain parts of the world, and I'm sure that will expand over time, it kind of made me feel bad that we were going to lose this amazing tool. But now, after studying the history of navigation, I'm sure we'll come up with something to replace it that's even more robust, even more accurate, hopefully easier to use and cheaper even than GPS. So I'm not worried about that at all anymore. So what I would like to do is I'd like to take a couple of episodes to talk about some of the main navigational systems that we see in aviation. And I'd like to dedicate one episode to each system, roughly in the order of complexity, right? Like the simplest system, like dead reckoning, should come first. And in fact, that's what we're going to talk about today. And then something more complex like GPS should come near the end, right? And so you might be asking, why should we even be studying old forms of navigation other than just for the novelty of it or the interestingness of it? Is there a good reason why we should study this? And I think that there is. At the very least, it is required of you to get your private pilot's license. You're required to do a paper flight plan, which is effectively like a variant of dead reckoning, which we'll get to later. So from a pragmatic standpoint, you need it to pass the exam. But why else might we want to learn about some of these older forms of navigation? So one, and the one you'll most commonly hear, is that it's good to know how to use many different forms of navigation in case one system goes down. In case your GPS breaks, you need to be able to use the other forms of navigation you have at your disposal. And if all else fails, you need to be able to fall back into paper flight planning, right? And there is kind of like a deeper philosophical reason why we might want to study the other ones. As I was reading about these different systems, I got to thinking that every time a new form of navigation is introduced, it adds another layer of abstraction on top of the previous system. And basically what that means is it makes it a little bit easier to use, and it makes it so that the user has to worry about less little details in general. It's easier, it's more convenient, right? And we definitely see that. A GPS is a lot easier to use than a sextant, right? So we definitely gain something. We gain convenience, and we also gain accuracy by using these newer systems. The GPS is also more accurate than the sextant and easier to use. It's not like it's a trade-off. It's just better. But we do lose something, right? So you lose by adopting full-time a newer system, you lose any skills or abilities that were needed to operate at the lower system, the previous one. And you also lose a little bit of a connection to the activity that you're actually doing, flying the plane. And what do I mean by that? So when you're flying a plane and using like a paper VFR flight plan as your main source of navigation, the act of navigating is intimately intertwined with the act of flying the plane, right? You're scanning outside the airplane, looking for the landmarks that you marked on your flight plan, making sure they're where you expect them to be. You're constantly looking at your airspeed and making sure that it matches up with the airspeed that you said you were going to fly on your flight plan. You're looking at your altitude to make sure you're at the altitude you said you would be at. You're checking your watch, the time, how long it's been between waypoints. You're looking at the ground maybe to try to estimate the wind speed and direction, to take that into account with your calculations. You also have a sectional open and you're comparing what you're seeing on the sectional to what you're seeing outside the plane. So at that point, like navigating and flying the plane almost blend into one very complex, mentally taxing task, right? Whereas when you're flying a plane using solely GPS, you don't have to worry about any of those things. The GPS handles all of it. All you have to do is just fly the plane in the direction the GPS tells you to, right? The two tasks of navigating and flying are very not intertwined at this point, right? They're just completely separate tasks. You're just flying the plane, and the GPS is anything that you're doing. The GPS is ingesting it and then using that to calculate like where you should go next, right? Like if you drop your speed or you increase your speed away from what you had planned on your flight plan, that's fine. The GPS adjusts and everything's good. Same with altitude. You don't have to like look at your watch anymore. You don't have to try to estimate the wind by looking at the ground. It does all of that for you. And so, I don't know, if you value that connection, which sometimes I do, I think it's worth knowing some of these more low-level methods of navigating. And I'm not saying that's even better. Like, for example, there are flights I do where I don't want to do all those things. I don't want to go through the mentally taxing work of navigating, and then maybe I'll rely on the GPS. And there's other times where I really feel like flying the old-fashioned way, and I want to do like paper flying. And then also having a simple system like a GPS can be very useful in an already high-stress environment. Like if you're flying a fast airplane in class Bravo airspace around a busy airport with lots of traffic, maybe you don't want to be trying to unfold the sectional in the cockpit with you while you're piloting the plane and talking to ACC and looking for traffic. Maybe it makes sense to kind of offload some of those tasks to the automated GPS system. So basically all this to say, the older, like less useful methods of navigation are still good to know for a variety of reasons. There's benefits to it, even if those benefits are something simple, like I want to feel more of a connection to my airplane. And so we're going to go with that assumption, and we're going to talk about all of the different navigation methods that you might encounter while you're flying a plane. So as I mentioned a couple of times, today I want to talk about what is arguably like the simplest form of navigation, and that's dead reckoning. So dead reckoning is a method of navigation where, given a known starting location and some information about how you moved away from that location, you can calculate your next location. So an example of this would be, let's say that you are at the point 0, 0 on Earth, 0 degrees latitude, 0 degrees longitude. Does anyone know where that is? 3, 2, 1. It's in the Atlantic Ocean, just in the, what is that called? The Gulf of Guinea, I think, just like below the overhang of Africa. So let's say you're in a boat at the point 0 degrees longitude, 0 degrees latitude. You have a little handheld GPS and you use that to verify you're actually at the point 0, 0. So once you're at that point, you throw the GPS in the water. We're not using it anymore. And our boat has a little compass. So starting at that point, let's say we turn the boat to the south and we cruise at 1 knot for 1 hour, and then we turn off the boat. We can then do a little bit of calculations to figure our exact new location, right? We traveled at 1 knot, which is a nautical mile per hour, and we did that for 1 hour, so we know that we've traveled exactly 1 nautical mile. We also know that when you're traveling along a meridian, basically when you're moving north to south or south to north, 1 nautical mile is right around 1 minute of arc. And so now we know that our new location must be, we're still in the 0 longitude, we haven't moved longitude, but our latitude is now 1 minute of arc south of the equator. And we were able to calculate that without any outside information. Like we didn't use any other signals from a GPS or a radio, we didn't use any outside landmarks. We simply used what we knew as our new location and then how we traveled to calculate what our next location must be. And then once you get there, we could turn the boat, travel at a new speed for a new amount of time, and then calculate our new location. And then turn the boat, and we keep chaining together these predictions like this and make our way to wherever we want to go. So that is the basics of pure dead reckoning. So it has some downsides, and to demonstrate, imagine that we're still in this boat, and we're starting where we were, 0, 0, so like kind of near Africa, on the west coast of Africa, and we want to use only dead reckoning with no outside sources, no landmarks, no GPS, no radio, nothing, and we want to travel around Africa, over past Australia, and then over to Honolulu, and we want to pull right into Honolulu. We do have a map on board and a compass. So we set off and we start doing all these things I was talking about, like doing a little leg and then calculating our new position, changing course, doing another leg, calculating our new position, and so on, making our way around Africa. So do you think that we're actually going to end up in Honolulu when we're all done? When our calculations claim that we're in Honolulu, will we actually be there? The reality is probably not. And we'll probably be pretty far off. And the reason for that is dead reckoning suffers from something called a cumulative error. So every time we measure something, it is not a perfect measurement. 1, because we are human, we are not perfect. And 2, because instruments are also not perfect. So when I first was saying like we should travel at 1 knot south for 1 hour, our timer that measures 1 hour is not going to be perfect. Our compass is not going to be perfect. So our hour measurement is going to be a little bit off. Our measure of our track is going to be a little bit off. And probably our speedometer is going to be a little bit off. And so then our calculated position is going to have a little bit of an error compared to our real position. And it's probably not that bad, especially if the seas are calm. But then when I turn the boat and then I go on the next leg, the prediction that I'm making for my next position is going to have all of the error from that first prediction, plus any additional error that I pick up in that second calculation. And so I'm doing this a lot of times. I'm going to pick up more and more error, and I'm going to get further and further from where I think that I am. And so this is what I mean by cumulative error. And so by the time we actually think we're in Honolulu, we might be hundreds or even thousands of miles off course. This is made especially worse in boating applications like this and in aviation, because we're moving through a fluid, right? Water in the case of boats, air for the case of airplanes. And so we'll stick with airplanes now because that's what this podcast is primarily about. But if we're trying to dead reckon with an airplane, we have wind to deal with, right? We may think that we're traveling due east, but if we have a crosswind, we might actually be traveling a little bit to the south and east at the same time, right? And from the cockpit, we're not going to be able to feel that without looking out and seeing the ground. We're not going to be able to feel that we're having a crosswind. So that will throw off our calculations. Also, the higher you go, the less dense the air is, the more your indicated airspeed differs from your true airspeed. We won't get into the details of that. Maybe we'll talk in another episode, but just know that that's true. And so our estimation of our speed will be more and more incorrect. And so on top of the cumulative error problem, we just have bigger errors when we're dealing with aviation. And so you might think that, this was a good idea in theory, but this actually is not going to work for navigation. The errors are just too big. And that's not exactly true. So the errors are manageable for smaller legs. Like you can use dead reckoning in an airplane for a small distance or a small time, a couple of minutes, and that'll be totally fine. The errors really blow up when you're using it repeatedly, like doing predictions based on predictions based on predictions, instead of using some sort of outside data every now and then to try to correct some of the errors. And so that's exactly what we do as pilots. Instead of trying to come up with a dead reckoning path from where I am now to my desired destination, one thing we might do is we might break up that path into a couple of little paths, each of which the end of each is marked with a known landmark. Obviously, if we're over the open ocean, we might not be able to do this. But if we're flying over land, we could pick something like a mountain, a lake, something we would recognize. And we should ideally pick these landmarks, these waypoints, to be no more than a couple minutes from each other at our desired cruising speed. So like I said, instead of dead reckoning all the way from here to my destination, I will just dead reckon to the first waypoint. And then hopefully the errors are small enough that waypoint or that landmark will be in visual distance of where I end up. And so I can measure, figure out when I should be over the landmark, and then I look out the window, the landmark's over there. So then I fly over the landmark, and that effectively corrects any errors that I picked up. And then I can dead reckon from the landmark, from the true point to the next landmark, doing the same thing, trying to get myself just within visual distance, do a correction by flying over the landmark, and continue until we get to our destination. And so by breaking it up into these little legs and then correcting my error at each point by physically flying over the landmark, we've gotten rid of the cumulative error problem. And this kind of variant on dead reckoning is exactly what they teach in the private pilot course, the PPL course. If any of you are pilots or student pilots and you've done the paper VFR flight plan, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. They make you plan a cross-country flight between two airports, and then you have to pick known landmarks that are every few minutes along that route. Like for example, when I was doing my training, I did a lot of my cross-country flights here in Central Florida. And so I would pick things like there was a lake that was a square. So that'd be a waypoint, maybe a cell phone tower, a farmhouse that I recognized, things like this. Anything that you'll be able to find from the air, even if you're off a little bit. And I do personally think it's a really good idea that student pilots do learn this, because it is kind of always foolproof, right? As long as you have some landmarks, this method will work if all other systems in your aircraft fail. If GPS goes out or is being spoofed, VOR is broken, who knows, whatever. You can always fall back on the paper chart and do a little bit of VFR flight planning, or dead reckoning with landmarks, if you want to call it that. So one thing you might be wondering is if anybody else uses dead reckoning besides student pilots, pilots in an airplane where all their systems have failed, kind of as just a last resort. Like surely an airliner does not use dead reckoning, right? They definitely always use GPS or some other system. And the answer is that dead reckoning is actually very common in modern aviation, but not in the way that I've been describing it. And it's not something that's being mentally done by the pilot. A lot of larger planes, private jets, airliners, maybe some turboprops too, I'm not entirely sure, have what's called an inertial navigation system or an inertial reference unit. You might see both names, it's INS or IRU. And what these are effectively is it's like an accelerometer and a timer in a little computerized thing. And it does dead reckoning calculations for you. And then every now and then it'll take a reading from the GPS to correct any errors. So I'm not entirely sure why airliners and other larger aircraft use these inertial reference units. I've heard that some other pieces of equipment prefer or require information from the IRU rather than from the other components, like location information. But one thing that it definitely works for is in the event of GPS spoofing or an outage of GPS, you can disconnect the GPS from the IRU, so the IRU will stop updating itself every couple minutes or seconds based on the GPS and just use its calculated positions. And so that gives you a little bit of it gives you some sense of where you're located when your other methods of navigation have failed. And because it is a computer, it is able to measure things a lot more accurately than humans, so the errors accumulate a lot slower. And so the IRU will stay accurate for a lot longer than a human pilot doing dead reckoning would. And so it's enough that, like, if you're flying through a patch of GPS spoofing, it should be fine to get you through it until you can connect to the GPS again and correct all the errors that have accumulated up until that point. I also don't know this for a fact. I should have looked it up. I think that spacecraft also use something like an inertial reference unit and dead reckoning to do calculations, along with some stellar navigation. So yeah, basically dead reckoning is alive and well these days. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. And even though it's been computerized in most cases, it's still a good skill for the modern pilot to know and understand. And like I said at the very beginning, it can be gratifying and a little bit fun every now and then to make a paper flight plan and actually like fly like they did in the old days. But yeah, I think next week we'll talk about some celestial navigation with my brother Hunter, because he's a little bit of an astronomer. But yeah, we'll see if he's available. But yeah, I hope you all enjoy this series on the navigation methods, because I'm very excited to go through these. I really like talking about this, and I hope that not only I learn a lot from it, but that you guys do as well. So yeah, thank you for listening, and we will see you in the next episode.
Thank you for listening to The Wing Wag. If you liked this episode, please consider subscribing. And if you're out flying today, make sure to give somebody a wing wag.